The courtroom was quiet, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that hung like humidity before a summer storm. Wooden benches groaned softly as people shifted in their seats. Veterans in carefully pressed uniforms, mothers holding folded flags on their laps, and one silver-haired man clutching a weathered service photo of his brother each, had come not for justice, but to witness its final gasp. At the heart of it all, seated beside the grieving widow of a decorated staff sergeant, was a man who didn't speak. Didn't need to. He wore his silence like armor, forged in discipline and pain. His posture was exact, his boots polished to a reflection. On his chest, above his ribboned uniform, shimmered the sacred blue and gold, the Medal of Honor. He wasn't the defendant. He wasn't the lawyer. He wasn't even scheduled to testify. He was just there to stand, to watch, to bear witness. And perhaps that was what unsettled the judge most. Seated at the elevated bench, Judge Vernon Cartwright peered down over his glasses, his tone already tinged with annoyance before the session began. He was known for his rigidity, his demand for order, and above all his intolerance for what he deemed distractions in his courtroom. When his eyes locked onto the gleam of the medal, he froze. "Bailiff," he said, nodding toward the tomb guard, "is that?" The bailiff leaned down and whispered, "Yes, Your Honor. Medal of Honor recipient, Sergeant Nathaniel Cross, retired." The judge narrowed his gaze. Uniform insignia is not permitted unless one is testifying or actively enlisted. "Sir," the bailiff said, hesitant, "this is a Medal of Honor." "I'm aware of what it is," the judge snapped, slamming his folder shut. He looked directly at Cross, whose gaze remained forward, unmoved. "Remove that medal?" The words dropped into the room like a bomb. People stiffened. A few blinked, unsure they'd heard correctly. Sergeant Cross didn't move. His face remained impassive, eyes fixed straight ahead. "I said, the judge," repeated louder, "remove it. This is not a parade. It's a courtroom. I won't allow unauthorized insignia distracting from proceedings." Slowly, Cross turned his head. His voice was quiet, calm, and unflinchingly clear. "Your Honor," he said, "this medal is not an insignia. It is the Medal of Honor, awarded to me for action in combat under the laws of this country. I do not wear it for show. I wear it for the men who didn't come home." A ripple moved through the gallery like wind through dry leaves. One Gold Star mother's hand instinctively moved to her chest. An older Marine clenched his jaw and bowed his head. The judge leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You are not above the rules of this court. I've given you a direct and lawful order. Remove that medal, or I will hold you in contempt." Cross didn't flinch. "With all due respect," he said, "you may command this room, but you do not command what this medal means. It does not answer to your comfort. It answers only to memory and sacrifice." Cartwright's face went red. "Bailiff," he barked. "If he doesn't comply, escort him out." But the bailiff didn't move. No one did. Instead, the silence grew, again thick, defiant. And then, from the back of the courtroom, a man in his 70s rose slowly, leaning on a cane. His army cap bore a faded 101st Airborne patch. His hands trembled, but his voice did not. "Your Honor," the man said, "I am a retired colonel. That man has earned the right to wear that medal anywhere on this planet. You're not asking him to remove a piece of cloth. You're asking him to dishonor the graves of every man he served with." Cartwright opened his mouth to speak, but another voice rose. This time, a woman, tears streaking her face, lifted a photo of a young man in dress blues. "My son," she said, her voice cracking, served under that man. "He didn't make it. Back Sergeant Cross did that medal. That's not just a memory. That's all I have of what they fought for." Now others stood, one by one. A veteran in a wheelchair, a young Marine Corps corporal, a high school student wearing his late father's dog tags, all standing, all silent. The judge, suddenly alone in his fury, pounded the gavel. "This is disorder. Sit down." No one did, not even his bailiffs. Instead, Sergeant Nathaniel Cross stepped forward. Just one step. His voice was quieter now, but it filled the room. "I walk in silence every day at Arlington," he said. 21 steps for those who cannot take another. I carry names in my heart that you'll never know. You see a medal, I see a promise. One I made to keep their stories alive." He looked straight at the judge. "You may strip my words from your record, but you'll never strip the meaning from this medal." The room didn't erupt. It didn't. Neat, too, the power was in the stillness, in the way even the walls seemed to listen outside. Someone began filming on their phone. Inside, the judge, visibly sweating, signaled for a recess and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. But the damage was already done. The clip of the exchange hit the internet by the afternoon. By nightfall, it had been viewed over 12 million times. The headlines were unforgiving. Judge orders Medal of Honor recipient to remove decoration, refuses. Honor versus power. Tomb guard silences courtroom with truth. Silent stand echoes loud nationwide. Veterans groups across the country mobilized. Gold Star families posted photos of their loved ones, captioned with #IST and with cross. And beneath all of it was a simple truth the judge had never understood. You can command a courtroom, but you cannot command silence born from sacrifice. By the next morning, the courthouse looked different, not in structure, but in spirit. There were news vans parked along the curb. Journalists with tripods, microphones, and urgent voices buzzed like hornets around the cold stone walls of the building that had, just hours earlier, tried to silence something sacred. But inside, the judge's chambers were quieter than ever. Judge Vernon Cartwright sat behind his desk, alone, his glasses folded neatly on the oak surface. He hadn't slept. His phone had buzzed through the night messages from the Bar Association, from the district attorney, from old colleagues who couldn't understand what had possessed him. He stared at the printout of a headline someone had slid under his door before dawn, the gavel that tried to silence valor and failed. It wasn't just a trending hashtag anymore. It was a reckoning. Veterans across the nation, men and women in every state, had posted photos of their own medals, their uniforms, their lost comrades. Retired generals, active duty officers, and even members of Congress had weighed in. One tweet, in particular, had gone viral. You don't order a Medal of Honor recipient to strip memory from his chest. That medal is not his, it belongs to the fallen. Shame on that courtroom. #I stand with cross. The judge rubbed his eyes. In truth, it hadn't been about the medal, not really. It had been about control, about maintaining the rigid decorum he had wrapped himself in 4 years. Courtrooms, he believed, should be ruled with precisional bending. But in chasing order, he'd trampled over something far older, far deeper than law. He had crossed a line, and now the country was watching. That morning, in a small cafe not far from Arlington Cemetery, Nathaniel Cross sat with a cup of black coffee and the same silent posture he always carried. He wasn't interested in interviews. He didn't care about fame. When a local news anchor politely approached and asked for a soundbite, he simply replied, "I said everything I needed to in court." She asked him how it felt to stand against a judge. "I didn't stand against a judge," he corrected. "I stood for the people who aren't here to speak." That was all. No theatrics, just truth. Back in the courthouse, the judge attempted to return to business. But it wasn't the same. Every pair of eyes in the room, every clerk, every attorney, watched him differently now. Not with fear, not with respect, with discomfort, as if they no longer trusted the floor beneath their feet when he was speaking. Midweek, an official letter arrived from the Office of Judicial Oversight. A formal review had begun. Had not come from Cross. It had come from the American Legion. On behalf of 1.3 million members, attached to the letter was a petition signed by over 400,000 Americans in under 3 days. Civilians, veterans, Gold Star families old, demanding the judge's removal. Even more troubling for Judge Cartwright was the internal request for his service record, not his court service, his military service, because decades long before he ever wore robes, he'd worn a uniform to dot in Vietnam. He had served 2 tours, earned a Bronze Star for coordinating a successful medevac under enemy fire. But he had never spoken much about it. Buried it, chose the gavel instead of the rifle. Law over legacy. But what he saw in Cross had stirred something he thought he'd buried forever. That's what frightened him the most. He hadn't asked Cross to remove the medal out of disrespect. He'd asked because it reminded him of what he used to believe in before the years turned justice into paperwork and memory into silence. Later that evening, Cartwright pulled out an old footlocker from the back of his closet. It was covered in dust. Inside, beneath an American flag folded with reverence, lay a faded set of dog tags and a photo of a young man named Marcus Elkins, his best friend, killed in an ambush in 1969. For a long time, Cartwright had carried Marcus's dog tags in his pocket, until one day he simply stopped, folded the grief away with the rest of his service, and placed it all inside that box. When Cross had spoken in the courtroom when he said, "You may command this room, but you do not command this medal," the words had pierced through Cartwright's armor. That night, Cross received a letter at his modest home outside Washington, D.C. It wasn't an apology. Not at first, just a single page. "There was a time when I understood sacrifice. I let the years convince me that order mattered more than memory. I was wrong. You reminded me of what I had forgotten." It was signed Vernon Cartwright. A week later, the judge's resignation was announced. He stepped down quietly, no press conference, no public statement, but word spread quickly. Major networks picked it up. The viral courtroom footage resurfaced. With updates, the phrase "crossed the line" took on new meaning in editorials. And yet, for all the national attention, Nathaniel Cross never spoke another public word about it. Instead, he returned to his post, not behind a podium, not in front of cameras. But on the silent path at Arlington. 21 steps 21 seconds. About face, repeat, rain or sun, day or night. Because for him, duty wasn't loud. It was precise, eternal, and sacred. One morning, as he prepared to relieve the previous guard, the commanding officer handed him a small envelope. Inside was a typed note, for reminding a broken man what honor sounds like. Marcus Elkins, sister enclosed, was something else. The original dog tags, the judge had returned them. Cross stood still for a long moment, the tags cradled in his white-gloved hands. Then he placed them in his breast pocket close to his heart and walked the line. 21 steps, 21 seconds. Just like before, but this time, the silence carried more than memory. It carried redemption. In the days that followed Judge Cartwright's resignation, something unexpected happened. Not a scandal, not a celebration, but a nationwide stillness. It was as though America collectively inhaled and remembered something it had forgotten, that honor, when quietly lived and fiercely defended, speaks louder than any verdict. News outlets tried to reach Nathaniel Cross for follow-up interviews. They sent emails, called his old commanders, even approached neighbors. But the answer was always the same. He's not interested in the spotlight, because Cross had never stood in that courtroom for attention. He hadn't planned to speak. He'd only shown up to support a fellow soldier's widow Someone, who had quietly fought a losing legal battle to get her husband's posthumous benefits. But when the gavel tried to shame the memory he wore on his chest, he stood not for himself, but for all those still buried in silence. What he didn't know was how many people that silence had touched. At first, it was just a few small vigils, quiet gatherings outside courthouses and VA centers. Veterans placing candles beneath flags, some holding photos, some just standing like statues in their dress uniforms, echoing Cross's posture, silent, unshakable. Then came the schools, teachers. Across the country, printed out the story, had students write essays on courage and civic duty. One high school in Oregon staged a play, reenacting the moment in the courtroom, not for drama, but to teach respect. Then came the ceremony. A month later, under overcast skies and the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, a special tribute was arranged by the government, not by political figures, but by veterans, Gold Star families, and civilians who simply believed that Cross had shown something sacred. The event was unofficial, but no one seemed to care. Thousands gathered, folded chairs stretched across the lawn like gravestones in neat rows. On stage, there was no pop band, no fireworks, just a podium, a flag, and an honor guard standing motionless beside a pair of empty boots. Nathaniel Cross sat in the front row in full uniform. But he didn't sit alone. Beside him sat the widow whose case he had quietly supported that day in court. Her hands trembled as she held a new certificate, proof that her husband's benefits had finally been approved. Behind them sat veterans from every war, all wearing ribbons that told stories they rarely spoke aloud. The audience rose as a young woman stepped to the microphone. Her voice was soft, her notes steady. She sang the national anthem, but something in her tones, something solemn. Unornamented, the words sound new again. When she finished, a man in civilian clothes took the stage. He wore no uniform, but carried a heavy presence. He introduced himself as Marcus Elkin's nephew. "My uncle died before I was born," he began. "But this month, my family got something back we thought we'd lost forever." His dog tags. They were given to a judge who forgot. What they meantand, returned by a man who never did. He turned to Nathaniel. "Sergeant Cross, you didn't raise your voice. You didn't threaten. You just stood. And in doing that, you helped the rest of us remember what standing really looks like." Applause followed Zoe Rising, not a spectacle, but a swell of gratitude. Then the chairman of the American Legion approached the podium. "We can't award you another medal," he said. "You already carry the highest. But we can offer something else." He turned to Cross and held out a folded piece of paper. "This is a joint declaration signed by over 3 million Americans, veterans, students, teachers, mothers, fathers, each adding their name to a pledge to stand up for honor even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's inconvenient." Cross stood as the crowd did, but he didn't go to the stage. Instead, he walked to the microphone, looked out over the faces, some tear-streaked, some proudly weathered. All united. Dan simply said, "I don't wear this for applause." He touched the medal lightly on his chest. "I wear it so no one forgets what others gave. And now, maybe, they won't." He stepped back. That was all. No speech. No need. After the event, as the crowd thinned, an older man approached Cross quietly. He wore civilian clothes, but his bearing was unmistakably military. He held out a photo. It was Judge Vernon Cartreacher's younger, standing in uniform beside a Huey helicopter, smiling with one arm around a soldier whose name was now etched into the Vietnam Memorial. "I'm his brother," the man said. "Vernon wanted you to have this? He asked me to tell you something." He paused. He said, "Thank you for standing when I didn't. You reminded me who I was supposed to be." Cross took the photo for the first time that day. His jaw tightened. He nodded once and said nothing. That night, back at Arlington, Cross resumed his post. The moon was full, casting long, pale shadows over the tomb of the unknown soldier. He adjusted his gloves, took a measured breath, and began his watch. 20-1 steps. Halt face, 21 seconds silence. Not the silence of erasure, but the silence of reverence. And somewhere beyond the gates of Arlington, in small towns, in cities, people stood just a little straighter when they passed a folded flag. Teachers pointed to the image of Sergeant Cross in class and said, "This is what courage looks like when no one's clapping." And in a courthouse in another state, a new Judge Young, fresh-robed, idealist chung a copy of the Constitution on his wall. Next to it, he placed a photo of Cross standing in that courtroom, wearing his Medal of Honor without apology, and under it, a simple quote, "You may command this room, but you do not command what this medal means." Back at Arlington, as the clock turned midnight, Nathaniel Cross continued his watch. Not for recognition, not for revenge, but because the greatest acts of honor aren't seen. They are felt, and they equate eternally like the steps of a soldier walking for those who no longer can.